we are in our culture and in our society, and really even larger than our society. In the world today, we're dealing with an energy that a lot of us haven't seen in our lifetimes, and it's having a huge impact on people individually, in our families, in our workplaces, and of course in our political system and throughout the world. So we're glad to talk about this, to have an opportunity to talk with you about how do we manage this environment of fear that we're living in. So just a quick hello. You see our pictures on the screen. I'm Howard Ross. I'm the founding partner of Cook Ross. I've been doing this work of diversity and inclusion and organizational transformation now for over 30 years, and I'll let Rosalind introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Rosalind Taylor O'Neill, and I am a consultant, principal consultant here with Cook Ross. I've known Howard for a lot of my life, and I am delighted to be here with everyone. Most of you, many of you may have known me from my time at Campbell Soup Company or MTV Network. So it's an incredible topic and a phenomenal time.
So we're going to jump right in and talk about why it is that this is so important. But just before we do that for a moment, let me just fill you in a little bit on Cook Ross. We've been around for 27 years. In September, it'll be 27 years. We're a certified woman-owned country, and we're based in Silver Spring, Maryland, which, for those of you who don't know, means that we're about a stone's throw from the Washington, D.C. line, just outside of the city. And we also have consultants in various other parts of the world. And we specialize in organizational culture development and transformation, leadership work, as well as diversity and inclusion, and of course with a particular specialty area in understanding unconscious bias. We have 30 full-time staff people. Actually, I think we're up to 35 now, plus about 25 additional consultants all around the world. And we've worked in 48 of the 50 United States and about 50 other countries. So what we'll be sharing with you is drawn from a perspective of working with a lot of people in a lot of places, a lot of different circumstances. So let's start talking about the topic itself, because this topic is in our space in a lot of different ways. Some of you have already been with us for some of the previous web seminars we've done on Islamophobia and then on transphobia. Rosalind and Leslie Traub, my other partner, did one on race and women, the conversation between race and women recently. And so if you've been with us before, there may be occasionally some similarities in what we're talking about just because there's some core information. But I think you'll find that this has some distinctions as well. So why is this an important topic? Let's think about some of the things that have been going on in the world around us. Just over the course of the last couple of months, we had the Paris attacks, and then the attacks in San Bernardino. We had the attacks in Brussels. We've had protests at funerals, and then, of course, the last attack at the Turkish airport. All of these kinds of things are going on all the time, and all of them are representative of the fear that we've had in society. But we know in our society we've also had even a deeper conversation about race, so we're going to watch this short video. Melissa, if you could play the video for us.
Yes. I am definitely I'm loading the video as of right now.
Thank you.
The videos have to be loaded, so we will ask that everyone has their lines muted as the video comes up and we start to play it. You want to make sure it will come through your computer, so make sure that your computer volume is on, and again, your lines are muted so no one else hears it. Once the video has stopped playing, if everyone can please give me a green check mark, that lets me know that it has played. Everybody has different bandwidths. So again, I'm going to go ahead and press the play button. Again, please make sure all lines are muted. And there we go. All right. I'm going to go ahead and give the ball back to Howard, and we will go ahead and continue on.
Thanks, Melissa. And of course, this isn't all of the situations we're dealing with. We know there are also the attacks on police in Dallas and Baton Rouge and other cities, and just a continuing sense that there's something going on around us. There's a sense of a culture of almost like a post-traumatic stress culture that we're dealing with, the tension in the political environment, both in the Democratic and Republican primaries and now in the general election, the strong tendency for people, it's us versus them that we have in our society. And this is what we really want to talk about today, is how this is affecting us. So we're going to start with a little poll here. And just see where you all stand on this question. I feel that fear is more a daily reality today than in the past 5 years. So you can, Melissa will set this up for us, but you can either click that you strongly agree, or neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And you can look on the right-hand side of your screen. You should see the poll, and go ahead and check it.
Awesome. Thank you, Howard. Yes, you'll have about 30 seconds, 30 to 45 seconds to give a little bit more time with quite a large group. Once you have all responded, I will go ahead and close the poll, and then I will apply the results, and everyone can see the percentage and the results. So we'll give about 30 more seconds. There's still about 75 people who have not responded. So if you had not responded, please take a moment to respond to the poll question. Thank you all so much, those of you who have responded. Again, there's about 60 more people who still have not responded, so please take a moment to go ahead and respond to the poll question. I will close the poll in about 10 seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. There's still a few who have not responded. WebEx is giving an additional 20 seconds. So if you have not responded, please go ahead and do so. You still have about 15 more seconds. Great. I'm going to go ahead and show the poll results.
Great. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Wow, so we can see that 76% of the people, and we've got, by the way, almost 400 sign-ins here, and I know that there's several places that we already know of from people who've communicated where there are groups of people watching off of the same sign-in. So we probably have as many as 500 people on this call, which I think says something in and of itself about how concerned we all are about this topic. So we look at these numbers, and you can see that 76% of the 500 people who are on this, or of the 400 people who are signed in, so that means over 300 people said they either strongly agree or agree with this statement that fear is more a daily reality today than in the past 5 years. And so we want to look at, how does this affect us, and what's the impact of that on our ability to function on a daily basis?
Well, I think that, Howard, I think it's really important to sort of put this in the context. I grew up in the South through the 1950s and 60s, and I haven't experienced the kind of daily tension that I'm experiencing lately. I was driving, I live in a rural area in Maryland, and I was driving along, and as I pass people, I now look at them through a different lens, a lens that I haven't used since the 1960s, 1950s in the South. Now, interestingly enough, at that time, I didn't experience much fear because I was a child. My parents, however, I'm sure did, and gave me some of that. But as an adult now, it's daily. And it is things like I'm in the grocery store, and I am in an area that is predominantly white and rural, and the checkout person says to me, I'm going to buy a gun. And it was just an interesting, we were just talking about, I don't know, something, and someone other came out, I'm going to buy a gun. And I said, why? And she said, because there's going to be a revolution. And I said to her, I don't think so. I hope not. Now, imagine that there's such fear going on, and you see it in this poll, that every day this is a part of people's lives.
Well, I think it's interesting, too. It's like as you're speaking that, Rosalind, because you and I both grew up in the same era. We're roughly the same age. And, that was the era of civil rights. It was the era of the anti-war movement. It was the area of, that era of a lot of upheaval. But even then, there wasn't the same kind of cleavage between them versus us that we see today.
Right. And by the way, you can always enter into chat if you have some things that you want to send to us. You can just send it to all, or you can send it to us specifically. But that's the powerful thing about where we are now in my life, and that is that it's daily. It is now the sense that when walking down the street, I look at people, and now I am able to, we'll talk about what I'm able to do about it, but it's very present, this sense of dis-ease. Which in fact is a disease. It is a sense of dis-ease, a sense of uneasiness that I cannot name based on something that has happened. So what we want to now ask you is, how is fear impacting you? So I want to ask you to, we're going to do a poll. And you can check as many of these as you want to. And under other, if you want to put something in chat, feel free. How is fear impacting? Is it worrying about member safety, family member safety? Is it feeling stress and tense? Is it finding yourself slipping into they, people like us, people like them, suspicion of people who look different? Maybe I'm less likely to speak up, or I'm more physically impacted. Howard, you and I were talking about what that means, that whole sense of...
Yeah, it's in the body. I think an awful lot of people are feeling the daily stress, like headachy, tired. There's all of this impact on just the worry that we carry with us.
Yeah, maybe for the first time in my life, I actually had a fleeting moment where I thought about buying a gun. It was fleeting. For some of us, it may be fear of travel. And so I just want you to... on the poll, to be able to just sort of make check marks or some way that we can find out kind of what's on your mind in terms of how's it impacting you.
The poll only has one response.
Oh, the poll only has one response. Oh, yeah. So we want you to pick the response that is most up for you at this point in time.
Right, understanding that most of us probably have several of these, but just pick one just to get a sense of it. And so go ahead and vote.
Someone was asking, and while you're all doing that, someone was asking, have I observed people sort of looking at me or staring at me? What's interesting is because you have a heightened sense of us and them, sometimes it feels like it. I don't know if it's actually more than usual, but I know that I'm looking at people more often with sort of a and that's the really powerful part of it. Where are we, Melissa, with the polling?
All right. So we have about 882 people who are finished, about 52 people who have not started. So they're still in progress. So I guess we'll close the poll in about 10 to 20 more seconds.
Yeah, we know you can only select one, unfortunately, but just choose one that's particularly appropriate for you, and we'll get a sense of it. Somebody also commented that there's some worry about minimizing actions that were warning signs, and sometimes when as we'll see in a little bit, we're going to talk about the psychology and actually the brain science behind what happens when people get scared like this. Is that when we're highly sensitized and on edge, little things that normally would pass by us can trigger us. And so those warning signs, those minimal actions that are warning signs, can sometimes create strong reactions in people that are inappropriate to the circumstance.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm walking down the street. I'm an African American. I'm in an area that does not have a lot of African Americans. I walk past someone. They look at me, and then I make up a story. and we'll talk about that. So I make up a story. Now, the more different they are from me, I'm likely to make up a story about them that is more different. Or police officer pulls up behind me. I have that moment where I think, oh my God, and that's how fear impacts us.
Now we've got the results of the polls.
Yeah. Let me see here. We're looking at about 53% of the folks. So a third of us are really worried about our family's safety. I think that that's a very important sort of piece. Feeling stress and tense. Significant number of us have some others, or I have no answer. But I want you to notice that the majority of folks are really feeling stressed, and they're worried about safety, their own and other people's safety. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so we also want you to be thinking about what's the impact on your organization.
Yeah, very important. And think about this. There are elevated levels of stress for others. If I'm feeling stressed, other people in my organization and your organization are feeling stressed. And that leads to sick leave, higher levels of conflict. Things set people on edge more easily, and lower levels of productivity. We're also looking at people who make talent management decisions, oftentimes based not on their fear, out of that sort of quick thing. Maybe poor customer service. I see someone, I'm waiting on someone, they come in, they look like something that triggers my fear in me. Of course, that leads to extremely important opportunities that are missed in businesses, and therefore reduced income. Reduced productivity leads to reduced income, and it's impacting all of our organizations.
We've got a couple of comments I just want to speak to. One person asked regarding the race conversation, should we be having this conversation in the workplace? What recommendations do you have for large corporations in having this conversation? The answer to the conversation is that we're always having the race conversation in workplaces. Sometimes we're having it out loud, and sometimes we're having it silently, because the issues are there, the dynamics are there, and the tension between people are there. And the danger with not talking about it, of course, is that when the conversation stays silent, we don't know exactly what people are reacting, responding to. We're actually going to be doing a series of free webinars in the fall about how to conduct those kinds of dialogues constructively, and we're going to also be offering a free resource guide to people to help them learn how to conduct those kinds of dialogues because they're so important.
Yeah.
Another one says, I believe that I've always treated people with respect. I believe I always looked people in the eye, said hello and good morning. I found myself recently going out of my way to behave more positively with people of color, which is crazy, not sure.
Right, right. And, you know, if you think about it, we begin to go out of our way because we are feeling stressed, because we are feeling sort of off balance. And we're feeling that both inside and outside of our organization. It doesn't matter if, as one person said, there are two of us, my husband and I are diverse, our children are biracial, one of us is white, one of us is black. We are both worried about our safety, both as a black person and as a white person. The truth of the matter is it's impacting us inside and outside of our organization. And here's kind of why.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about what happens at fear, and particularly how it impacts bias. You know, how do we see the world? Because we're learning so much about the mind and the brain. Over the last 15 to 20 years, we've learned more about the brain than we've ever known, and we know now how we make decisions. We see somebody out there, I'm calling it in this case a catalyzing person or circumstance, but we actually don't see that person for who they are. We see them through the lens of our background experience. So as Rosalind said, or, you know, if any of us are walking down the street and we see somebody, especially if they're different from us, what we do in our mind is immediately look at that person and go back into our brain, especially our fast brain, which is in the limbic system, in that green area you see there, and especially the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. The amygdala picks up on that difference and sends a signal quickly to the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, says, what is that? It's almost like going to the filing cabinet to see if you can remember something that you've seen before. And if that person is representative of some image that we've seen before that's associated with fear, or danger, then the brain will be more likely to associate that fear or danger with people. We quickly have to sort out that something is safe before we can see something positive. So if we put that in the context of some of the images that we see regularly on TV, whether they're images related to terrorism or young African-American men stereotyped as criminals or police officers stereotyped as being hostile, any of these things, then immediately that fear occurs for us, and we have the very quick, fast emotional brain response. Now, of course, if both parties in that case are having that kind of response, we could see that that could be especially problematic. So if you put ourselves, for example, in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, and Darren Wilson, the police officer, comes into town, the white police officer, he was quoted later as saying, "I knew I was going into hostile territory because the citizens in that area didn't like the police." So he's on high alert. And then Michael Brown, this young African-American man, walks down. He sees a white police officer. In a history of a town where there have been issues between white police officers and the African-American community, he's on high alert, and it's like whatever happened there, a match hits gasoline. And this is one of the challenges we have with everybody being on high alert. We're all so hypersensitive. So the fast brain is making these decisions very, very quickly. We do have the capacity, and it lives in our prefrontal neocortex, the red area here, the slow brain, to have thoughtful consideration of what we're thinking and feeling. This is the part of our brain that we use quite regularly, and we have thoughts like, what made me think about that? Or, boy, I'm angry, but I'm not going to say that. Or, count to 10 before you speak. Or these kinds of thoughts that help regulate. But what happens, as we'll see in a little bit, what happens during times when we're highly stressed is that the fast brain can take over. Now, before we continue, we've got somebody who's talking about being in a biracial family, talking about her husband and herself, worried about their safety, both of us, living in Baltimore. Their children, on the other hand, who are biracial, and don't know how to talk about it because they didn't see what they saw, so their memories are much different, says. That doesn't mean they're without bias because TV and media have created a different set of reference points, and I think that's important for us to realize that one of the things that's influencing us tremendously right now is that where it used to be years ago that as parents we had the opportunity to create an environment for our kids and to manage the environment of what our kids are exposed to, today with the advent of media that we have, that may not necessarily be the case.
Well, and it's not only, it's constant and it's immediate. It's on the phones, it's on my phones, it's on my laptop, it's on my television, it's on everything, and it is, in fact, sort of a constant set of, and more fear stuff than safety stuff.
That's right.
And that's really what's true. So more and more of us, if I turn on the news and you just take a piece of paper and put an X every time you see something that creates fear and a check mark every time something does not, I think you'd have a page of X's and very few check marks. Yeah,
and so as our friend and associate brain scientist up in Canada, Sukhvinder Singh Obi, says, our brains seem to have evolved to be good enough most of the time. This is a very imperfect system. It's there for a purpose. Our system of bias, of course, is there as what we might call as our unconscious danger detector. It's helping us be safe. And somebody said, seeing this as creating a form of PTSD, and I would agree completely that we're living in a form, in essentially societal post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, how does this show up? Well, we have a couple of studies quickly to share with you. This was a study done by Justin Levinson, who's a researcher at the University of Hawaii. He showed people these two pictures, which you can obviously see are the same person, doctored using computer photography, one to look African-American, the other to look white. Prospective jurors were given a fictional incident in which William on the left or Tyrone on the right was considered the potential perpetrator. Participants, they found, were more frequently remembered aggressive details when Tyrone rather than William was the defendant, even though they were given the exact same information. And he concluded that the race of a civil plaintiff or criminal defendant can act implicitly to cause people to misremember a case's facts in racially biased ways. In other words, it's almost like when the person we see's behavior doesn't match up with our stereotype, we have Teflon in our brain. It doesn't stick. But when it does match up with it, it sticks very fast, almost like there's a sticky paper there or Velcro. They went on to find that participants shown a photograph of the dark-skinned subject were significantly more likely to find ambiguous evidence probative of guilt, and that they were also more likely to believe that the suspect was guilty, both on a scale of 1 to 100 and by a traditional guilty and non-guilty measure. So we know that this is the case. In another study, Jennifer Everhard of Stanford University, who recently won a MacArthur Fellowship for her work in the area, showed participants in the study pictures of African-American men who were convicted of capital offenses against other African-Americans. Now, the reason she did black-on-black crime is because we've known for years that, because there have been over a dozen studies that have shown that juries and judges tend to give harsher sentencing to African-Americans when they commit crimes against white people than when they commit crimes against other African-Americans. So they wanted to remove that as a factor. And they showed people pictures of African-American criminals who had committed capital offenses against other blacks. These, by the way, are just test pictures. These are not actual criminals. And then asked them to sort them by Afrocentricity of appearance, particularly darkness of skin, and went back to look at sentencing and found that men with darker skin were 2.5 times more likely to get the death sentence than people with lighter skins. Now, if that doesn't terrify us, then I don't know what social justice is about.
Yeah. One of the questions that that came up on here is, you know, does this impact some of the violence that we've seen, some of the issues around shooting in police? And what we're talking about here is when fear takes over and we don't sort of slow it down. Verna Myers says we need to reform our image of young black men. We need to see them as a part of our future and to love them. This same sentiment can apply to any group of others, Muslims, transgender people, people who are differently abled, older, younger, that in fact we need to find some place because, yes, what happens in our brains happens quickly. It's not like we create a story based on nothing. So we see more violence, we see more images, and then we behave as if those images are true.
And there's no question that many of the things that we're seeing have been going on for years and years and years, and anybody who's studied diversity in the criminal justice system, as we have, knows that that's the case. But now what we do is we have people with cell phones in their pockets that have cameras in them and you know, with a high sensitivity to recording the things that they're seeing. So we're seeing these behaviors in ways that we never saw them before. And then once those pictures are taken, they get put on the internet and they go flashing around through, you know, through potentially millions of hits in a period of days.
And you see them often. So I'll see the same photo. You'll see the same crime that happens 7, 8, 10, 12 times during a 2-day span of time, which makes it seem like there are 10 occurrences when in fact it's just the same one that gets recorded over and over again in the brain.
And of course it's important to recognize that they're not individual responses that we have. We see an incident, but we see that incident in the context of what's happened previously. So at this point, for example, after all of these incidents of terrorism, when a new incident occurs and you hear that somebody is shot, I know that I had that reaction when the incident happened in Munich the other day when the man came into the shopping center. Immediate thought is this a terrorist attack? Because that's the context. The same thing is true when you hear about an incident between somebody and a police officer. Right. So all of these things are happening. So if we go back to our discussion about the brain for just a minute, we're learning now much more than we've ever known about what actually happens during these times. Some people, Daniel Goleman, the person we consider the father of emotional intelligence, calls it an amygdala hijacking. What happens when we're highly triggered by fear at this point is that the amygdala goes into overdrive. The fear protection system of the brain goes into overdrive. And the body is flooded with a cocktail of chemicals, adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, which put us on high alert. Now, this is a complete survival mechanism, and my guess is that everybody on this telephone call has had that feeling in your body. You're driving down the street and a ball rolls in front of your car and you slam on the brakes, stopping just in time, and you feel in your body that chemical release, that it's a very uncomfortable, unpleasant feeling, at least for me it was, it has been at the times I've had it. You also feel it in the sense that you're short-tempered or you're somebody comes up behind you and says boo, and you jump. It's almost like the emotional system has sunburn and is sensitive to the touch. And this is what happens when an amygdala hijacking occurs. And we know now, Ben Palmer, a colleague of ours in Australia, has identified what happens during these times, and there are three basic parts of this response. The first is a reactive response, and that is fight, flight, or freeze. So the fight response is we go into high protection mode and we either attack or we get very aggressive. The flight mode is the opposite. We contract, we pull back, and we get into highly protective mode, and sometimes we just freeze. We just go into shock. The second thing that happens is that we desperately want to have control of our situation. When we're feeling frightened like this, we want to go into control mode. And one of the ways that characterizes itself is beginning to find a desire for some external force who can control things, who can make things better. If you remember after 9/11, for example, immediately after 9/11, President Bush's approval rating jumped to 93% because people wanted the president to take charge, and that obviously went across party boundaries. If we look historically at the times in the past when fascism has taken over in countries like Germany, or especially in the 30s where you had Germany and Italy and Spain and places like that, all of them the result of societal dis-ease, to use Rosalind's word, places where there was economic upheaval and the like. And then finally, we begin to believe that this is a permanent situation, that it's pervasive, that it's all around us, and it's personal. It's going to get me, which is why just recently a poll showed that more than 2/3 of people living in rural environments in America believe that they're personally susceptible to a terrorist attack, which is not logical given what we've seen historically about where terrorist attacks occur, but it's very illustrative of how we feel that it's all around us and it's going to get us.
And that notion around the desire for control is very important, because what it says is, I will protect mine. And I think a lot of that is why people are thinking about ways to protect, that sense that I can control the area around my yard. In fact, it's not true, but it feels like it. And that's where many, many people have gone.
Somebody asked or said that I think it's what makes people quickly respond by saying, oh, he or she must have done something to warrant the police shooting. Yeah, we want to try to understand. We want to try to put it into a context we know. Now, one of the things that happens in circumstances like this is if we have a real threat on the part of a small segment of a group of people. So let's use terrorism as we see it today. We know that there's a small percentage of Muslims who have committed terrorism in the world, and anybody who studies this knows it's an actually incredibly small percentage of the roughly 1.5 billion Muslims who are in the world. And yet when we get into this amygdala hijacking, what happens is that real threat about those few people becomes a perceived threat about all of the people, because for the mind that's terrified, it's easier for us to say, just keep all of them away from me than it is for me to try to figure out which ones are safe. And this is where stereotyping becomes so dangerous. We take those very real circumstances that happen and we turn it into a broad application to a whole group of people.
That's where we have I see one police officer.
That's right.
And I now have this whole perceived threat about all police officers.
That's exactly right. So even though we know that overwhelmingly police officers are public servants who are out to try to do a good job and doing the best they can in incredibly dangerous circumstances, any police officer can now be perceived as a threat. So this is going on now in both directions, and it's important for us to realize, even though that we see it deeply rooted in wherever we are in that equation, it's also going on the other side. I once heard it said that every villain is a hero in their own story. Yeah. So fear intensifies bias.
So we're going to talk about some of the ways that you see it in your world. And I think this is important for us to think about. How do you see the dynamics of fear showing up? Maybe it's people in the workplace are more circumspect. So we're going to do this as a poll. You can choose one. Maybe it's politics or creating tension at work. I want you to really think about, in your world, you notice people are spending time with people who are more like them, or people talk about each other rather than to each other. and or maybe you're hearing more offensive comments. So would like to ask you to do a poll. Melissa, can you pull this one up on a poll for us?
I apologize. This poll was not created. So if everyone can, if everyone can go ahead in their chat box and
go ahead and chat box.
Can we do the marking?
Or we could, well, we could, although depending on where you are. But anyway, go into your chat box and just sort of give us some sense about
just put a number, put down the numbers.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6.
And feel free to put down as many of these numbers are appropriate to you.
Yeah, hearing more offensive comments.
There's a 6 and a 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A 1 and a 2. A 2 and a 5, a 6.
Yeah.
A 2, 6, 4, 3, 6, 2, 3, 6, 3. All of the above, somebody said. 1 through 4, 3, 3, 4 and 5, 1, 3, 5, 3 and 5. 1 through 6, somebody says, and a 5. 2, 3, and 4.
So what we're seeing, and you all can keep putting them in, what we're seeing is that we are seeing these dynamics every day. We are seeing discussions about race feeling risky. Even though I'd like to talk about it. I'd like to talk about it so that I can, in fact, sort of ease my world, that people are talking about each other rather than to each other, and that people are hearing more offensive comments. And it feels like I'm hearing more, even if I'm not.
Yeah, and one of the things that happens at times like this is that we do have a desperate need to talk about it, but because we're afraid to talk about it with the other, whoever that other is defined as, we instead talk about it with people like ourselves. So white people have conversations about race, and people of color have conversations about race, or Democrats have conversations about politics, and Republicans have conversations about politics. And the challenge with that is that we know from some very exhaustive research that's been done is that if you put together a mixed group of people to talk about a subject, the tendency is for people to move towards moderation, to move towards middle ground. It's a natural tendency. Not every time, of course, but it is a natural tendency. If you put people in like groups where you're only talking about people like yourself, the tendency is the exact opposite. It will tend to move us towards polarity. So this becomes a real challenge because we almost live in an echo chamber. We're going to talk about that relative to the media as well. Let's see, we have a couple say, the overly hateful political climate does not help, and that's absolutely true, Bob. And let's see,
a lot of the
leaders don't know what to do or say in our organizations, and so sometimes because we don't know how to deal with these conversations or even to name that they're there, that goes on as well. Our work is in part about helping people have these conversations. We have the conversation with our colleagues all the time across race and other lines, and that's really good to hear because we can do that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of regulatory, there's a lot of risk that's involved in things that feel to me like I would get in trouble. It's also, I hear more offensive stuff, and if I'm hearing more offensive comments, I'm now making up stories. And so what we do is really to go to
and somebody said here that it's dangerous and scary if you're raising kids in the country right now. And that's of course where it hits us the hardest.
So what we do is we go to our communities of impact. We go to our communities of identity, because I need to feel safe. So I'm now going to, I don't have to worry about feeling safe when I find myself with people who are like me, because being excluded from a group is a powerful thing for us. As a matter of fact, it triggers activity in the same regions of the brain as physical pain. Now, if you think about this, if I'm walking down the street and I am an African-American woman, and I'm walking down the street and there's a group of young white males standing on the corner, and we're just all waiting for the light to change. One of the things that I want is to feel like I am a part of. So I might even say something to them like, oh, where are you heading? Some way. If, in fact, it becomes clear that I am excluded, people talk about it as it was painful. Most of us have been to at least one party where we felt like we didn't belong. Either we were dressed wrong, we got the wrong invitation, it was a group where we didn't feel a part of it, and that is phenomenal for us. So we'll do pretty much anything to find ourselves in a place where we can feel like we're a part of it. Melissa's going to play a video for us because we will do anything
to try to fit in with the group.
To try to fit in with the group. It's very important to us. So we're going to do something.
Can you run this video for us now, please?
Yes, I'm getting it loaded.
Thank you. You know, one other thing is, you know, you feel yourself getting sucked into it. I notice even for myself in the political campaign now, you know, finding myself getting sucked in ways, even though, you know, I try to resist it, and then sitting back and say, wow, you know, I really got hooked. I really got triggered because you get pulled into this. And I'm sure that some of you can relate to that as well. All right, Melissa, you can run it.
Perfect. Again, please remember to mute all lines. Once all lines are muted, I'm going to go ahead and start the video. And then please give me a green check mark once the video has stopped playing.
All right. Now, we can laugh at that because it's very funny, but of course, we all have seen ourselves, you know, do things like this, you know, even simple ways. You go out to dinner one night and you say, I'm not going to have any dessert tonight until everybody else orders dessert. And then you say, what the heck, I'll have dessert. But sadly, it also occurs when people get into a mob mentality. And there are a number of comments I just want to note here. One person said, I had just had a conversation today with our comms team suggesting that we put out a directive, but we won't discuss religion, politics, or race, or other social issues. I had to talk them out of that message and redirect the message to having respectful dialogue and being aware that others may not share your views. Would you advise companies to host sessions to get more middle ground, at least in the workplace? The answer is yes, and you have to be sure that you're prepared to know how to conduct those dialogues, and that's why we're preparing that resource guide for people. We'll also be getting to, towards the end of our talk today, we'll be getting towards some things that we can do to move those conversations forward. Somebody asked if these videos would be available. Yes, they're available on YouTube. This one's called Face the Rear. The first one is called 23 Ways, and you can get those videos for yourself. Let's see, one more. I work on a global team. We all work virtually. Because we all work in different countries, as a result, we don't talk about what's happening in our own individual societies, how it's impacting us. My work relationships feel more superficial compared to other work relationships I had in the past. And that's important for us to get. When we don't talk about it, it's like we're walking around encased in shells and we're not really interacting with each other. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're learning about how we respond, because we know that we're pulled as human beings between two diametrically opposed points. One is a remarkable capacity we have for mirroring, for sensing what's going on with people around us. And we know that this comes from the premotor cortex of the brain. We actually produce mirror neurons. We've all had a mirror neuron experience. You're watching a TV show, something happens, let's say somebody gets punched in the stomach or hit in the head, and you feel yourself wince, almost as if it's happening to you. This is a response that's built into us as human beings for the purpose of being social animals, so that we can sense what's going on with people around us. And it creates a phenomenon we call homophily, and that is roughly means love of same. We're drawn to people who are similar to us because we can sense. Rosalind, as an African-American woman, I, as a white man, may have different senses of what's going on, may pick up things differently because our cultural orientation, our experience with people has us read signals that each of us might not read with somebody else. The other side of it is that we know that from a very early age, and scientists have shown that this is true from as early as 3 months old, and some believe even earlier, we already begin to develop a trend to establish them versus us. Some wonderful research being done on this by a woman named Karen Wynn at Yale University, who's found that as early as 10 months old, children show a very discernible effort to choose that which is consistent with their beliefs or the things that they enjoy. They give these babies 2 bowls of food, let's say graham crackers and green beans. The baby chooses one that they like. My guess is it's the graham crackers, Rosalind. And then another researcher comes in with 2 stuffed animals and has them pretend to eat those bowls of food, and more than 80% of the time, the baby chooses the stuffed animal that ate the food that they like. This is at 10 months old, and this creates, of course, the phenomenon of xenophobia, the fear of the other. And we're in a constant tug of war between these 2 points. And what can happen, of course, is that to the degree that we can relate to what's going on, because those people are like us, we may align. So if we go back to the dynamic between police officers and young African-American men on the street, we might tend to align more on the side that's more like us. Fear makes people objectify others and simplifies identity, and because of that, it intensifies the sense of threat. It makes us even more fast-brain operating and less rational than usual. It also, these fearful times that we're in, intensifies the us versus them thinking, and a lot of us, of course, are experiencing that right now in our political dynamic for whichever side we're on. Once we have an us, we want to act like our people, and we see things through our lens.
Right.
So just as an example, if we look at these words, we know that these are very controversial words in our society, and we argue back and forth, and different people argue back and forth about what these words mean. But what we don't realize is that we're not really looking at 3 words here, because there's an invisible word for each side of that argument that we don't see and we're not consciously aware of, but which dictates that response. For some people, what this means is only Black Lives Matter, and therefore the response is, wait a minute, it's not true that only Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. For other people, what they see is Black Lives Matter too. And in that context, it's no. The reason we're saying Black Lives Matter is because we want to make sure that Black lives are not left out of the mattering, so to speak.
Right.
And so, but the problem is that's very clear to us intuitively, emotionally, but it's not spoken, and so we don't even realize that that's where the conflict comes from.
And what happens is we look for what confirms our beliefs and ignore those things that contradict them. And all of us have done this. We read things that confirm it. And so we have a belief. I believe that when people are police officers, this is what they're going to do. It leads to an action. So now whenever I see them, I am suspicious. I therefore look suspicious, and that has an impact. And it still feeds into our belief and our actions and our impact, and it happens very quickly. So if you take a look at your life and think about how it's personally, how you experience fear, what triggers it. I'm going to show you 3 things that have come to me recently. One is this notion of guns. You know, I now have this feeling that everybody in the city that I live in has a gun. Now, I know that's probably not true. I would guess that no more have them today than they had them before, with the exception of a few. But I have this notion. I see a Confederate flag. I have grown up seeing Confederate flags, and you see one here and one there. Now, when I see a Confederate flag, I have this moment of, uh-oh, something bad. And the Blue Lives Matter, there's this whole piece of police officers. Now, that's very important because I actually grew up in a world that, for many people, it's really different. And that is, I grew up with my father, the picture on the upper right-hand side. My father was a police officer. So I grew up with police officers. The picture at the lower part is when my father and his group became detectives. And these were men who were, in fact, uncles to me. I knew them well. I cared about them. So now I have this dissonance, this cognitive dissonance, which comes from, it's like I see a police officer and I think, oh my God, my heart races, and I think, wait a minute, I know police officers. As a matter of fact, a significant number of my friends, even as an adult, are in fact police officers in Los Angeles, in Arizona, here in Maryland, And so I have to hold these contradictory beliefs at all times. I know everyone in my family has a gun. When it used to be the thing that when you turned 16, you were given a gun for your birthday. I chose not to take one, thought for a party instead. But it's this way in which I think, I know people who have guns. I'm not afraid of my brother. I'm not afraid of my nephew. I'm not afraid of my nieces. That becomes the issue for us, is that you can't figure it out, that it leads to this stress, and it makes you then do things that when you're confronted with new information, they conflict with your existing ones, and that's really uncomfortable.
And once we have that point of view in our mind, of course, we gather data to support it. John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist and diplomat, once said, most human beings, given a strongly held point of view and evidence to the contrary, will quickly go about refuting the evidence.
Absolutely.
And so when something comes that contradicts that which we believe, we find a reason to discount it. Well, there's an exception to every rule.
Right.
And that contradiction even exists within inside us. We have a view of how we'd like to be with people. I don't want to be biased. I don't want to be bigoted. And yet, at the same time, we have an emotional reaction that we are more afraid of that particular kind of person or more hesitant. And so that same dissonance that Rosalind was describing externally is also going on inside of us. And one of the things that leads to all this is that we're constantly being primed to believe certain things. Now, priming is an interesting phenomenon. You can create ways for people to believe certain things. So, for example, organ donation is an interesting study of this. Organ donation is done now all over the world, and particularly in the Western world, in Europe and U.S. especially, it's done in a very consistent way, and that is when you get your driver's license, you could check a box for organ donation. And some researchers studied it in Europe, and what they found was this chart that you see on the right-hand side, these are all countries, as Sweden, Portugal, Poland, Hungary, France, Belgium, and Austria, all countries in which a huge percentage of people leave their organs. You can see Sweden is the lowest at 86%, the rest are over 98%. On the left side, Germany, UK, Netherlands, and Denmark, very low participation in organ donation. And they were fascinated by this. At first they thought, well, maybe this is because there's sort of a higher level of altruism in the cultures of this country, of these countries. But then they looked at some of these, for example, Germany and Austria, which culturally are very, very similar, and they found that that wasn't a reason at all. The reason was, very simply, that the ones on the right, people were given the opportunity, the assumption that they would leave their organs unless they checked the box to opt out. The ones on the left, people had to check the box to leave their organs. One check mark had that much of an impact. Somebody said, by the way, our friend Bart, said that the threat triggers the need to connect with our tribe. Rosalind mentioned that something's been triggering with recently. In a city here in Pennsylvania, the KKK recruitment flyers are being left on doorsteps. The opportunity to capitalize on fear. I haven't seen or heard of this in a while, which triggers something within me, which goes back to the early 70s. Exactly. So this priming happens all the time, and it's especially true around race in our society. For example, last year, March of last year, and within 2 days, there were 2 burglaries out in Iowa. These are the 2 stories that were shown in the Iowa newspaper. This is the first one, 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested and suspended. And you can see these pictures, which came right out of their college yearbook, it looks like. A day before that, these men were arrested for burglary, and you can see these pictures, which look more like mugshots. Now, what is somebody who's watching the news left with from these pictures?
Right. Absolutely.
And then we're going to show you another way that this happens in terms of the media. So, Melissa, if you could show this video, please. Melissa? I don't know if she's there. I think we may have lost Melissa, so we're just going to keep moving forward. Let me see if I can show it. I guess not. All right. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to show that one. We'll send out a link to this, but I'm going to describe it just so you can see it. What we would see in this video is that it's a video of a news story that happened in Chicago a few years ago, of a drive-by shooting, and in the video you see a young 4-year-old boy among a couple of people who were interviewed, and the reporter is asking him, what do you think about this? What are you going to do? And he says, he says, I'm going to get me a gun when I grow up. And then they cut back to the reporters who were saying, boy, isn't that terrible? And they all agree it's terrible. And the second video, which we also have here, and this came from the Maynard Institute for Journalism. If you go to www.mije.org, you'll be able to get these videos. Let me show you on that screen on the last one so you can see it. There, it's www.mije.org. You should be able to find these videos. In the second one, which is of the same video, the same exact video of the little boy, but it's taken by a bystander with a cell phone, you see the young boy saying, I'm going to get me a gun when I grow up, and then he continues to say, I'm going to be the police. Now, those are very different messages. One is left with, here's this young boy already being trained to be a thug, and the other is, this is a young man who wants to be a police officer. And yet, you know, the media is constantly adapting this for us and preparing us in this way to look at it. The fear makes people objectify others, simplifies identity, and it intensifies that sense of threat, and makes us even less rational than usual. And it's also generative. We have the fear, it causes behavior. We get defensive, for example. That defensiveness, we start to treat the people who cause that defensiveness by being reactive. That causes hurt and anger on the other side, which creates a counter-reaction. And so it just continues on, and this is an accelerating cycle that continues on and on. So we get stuck in this cycle of fear. The question, of course, becomes, how do we break that cycle? How do we move forward?
And that's really an important piece for us, and a number of you have asked in a couple of different ways, how do we move forward? First and foremost, we really have to acknowledge that there is a reality that people are dealing with, that we are, in fact, seeing things that are creating fear, that people are worried, people are concerned, people are not sure how to deal with this. We need to make sure that we are acknowledging the reality. So to say to me, well, there's nothing to be afraid of, doesn't acknowledge my reality, that I feel like I am an only, that I feel like there are not folks around. And so it doesn't acknowledge that. Secondly, next, become an observer of how fear impacts you for two reasons. One is, the more I understand how my fear is not based on, by the way, my experience. It's not based on my real daily experience. So my fear of the guy who's driving down the street who doesn't look like me is not based on the fact that he came over to my house earlier in the day and did something. It is based on something else. So become an observer of how it impacts you, because it will help you to then begin to understand how other people might.
And this can happen in our families. All of a sudden, we're more protective of our children. We're more frightened about what's going to happen to our partners, our spouses at work, you know, all of these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's very important. Observe yourself and tell yourself the truth about your biases. Yes, I see this person in my rearview mirror, and they're driving a truck, and I have to say to myself, okay, Rosalind, let's talk about what your biases are. You're making up a story about that man. You know nothing, or that woman, you know nothing about them. And then begin to share with people that I recognize how my biases show up, and I can talk about them. We talk about prime yourself, and that is do something like take the implicit association test. Do things that begin to give you information and data that you can then share with other people. You can find that at implicit.harvard.edu implicit.
It's also very helpful to consciously expose yourself to avatars or exemplars from groups that you know you have negative biases about. You know, it's been interesting to watch the last few days, and I'm not of course talking about the political controversy around this Muslim mother and father who spoke at the convention the other night, but just how that image, a positive image of a patriotic Muslim, has deeply impacted people.
Right.
Of a father and a mother of a young man who was a hero and saved other soldiers.
Right.
Has positively impacted people. It's almost like throwing a stone in the other bucket to all the negative images of Muslims that we've seen depicted over the course of the last period of time. And when we begin to notice that bias, one of the things that's important to recognize is that we can never make bias go away. it may ease itself over time, but we can't force it to go away. And the metaphor that we like to use is you actually don't have to make it go away if you're conscious and aware of it. It's like stepping on the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. Any of you who remember driving clutch, I just came back from Scotland, taking my son to Scotland, and I had to drive a stick shift for the first time in many years. And on the wrong side of the road and the wrong side of the car, let me tell you, it was an adventure. But when you step on the clutch, the car doesn't stop. The engine doesn't stop moving. It simply stops moving the car forward. And similarly, when we can look at our biases and name our biases, look at our fear and name our fear, it has that much less of a chance of impacting our behavior.
Someone was saying that, you know, we're in the nonprofit business, and so we worry about sort of, they have a place in the global discussion, but you have to be careful because there may be some impact on our mission. So it's true that we have to pay attention to how it works out. What we're saying here is, until I can actually look at it in me, I can't have empathy for it in someone else. I can't see it in them. And I cannot, in fact, see how, if you will, for the majority of the time, how not rational it is. I can't change anything until I can accept it. I cannot change my biases until I can accept them. And condemnation, going, I don't have any biases, I don't want to have it, bad people have them, will not liberate, it will oppress, as the statement from Jung.
Yeah, and it's just, and it's also important to realize that the same process that we're talking about as individuals can also happen collectively. So I know it's hard in organizations, and we're not recommending, of course, for litigation reasons, among other things, you sit around and say, well, I'm biased about this and I'm biased about that. That's not always the best plan. But you can create ways for people to talk about what they're afraid of. What are you nervous about? Where do you find yourself stressed? What are you feeling? And once people have an opportunity to share that with each other, those shells that we talked about that they're walking around in begin to melt. I've begun to understand that you're not just coming from some crazy point of view, you're actually afraid, and I'm afraid too. And if we can talk about this together, and this is why the kind of dialogue that we talked about earlier in our organizations is so important. By the way, somebody asked when that resource guide will be available. We expect it to be available after Labor Day, shortly after Labor Day. So we'll have that out for you, and we're going to have, as I said before, a series of coaching sessions like this, but they'll be designed particularly for people who want to conduct those kinds of dialogues. We'll talk about what are the specific things to keep in mind to conduct those dialogues safely and in a responsible way, because we're not encouraging you to just jump in without any preparation.
No, and we are saying that there is a way to embrace and explore fear, that there are ways to talk about it. We had a webinar a couple of weeks ago where Leslie and I were talking about the issue of race and with white women and women of color. There is a way to explore. And part of that exploration is really to begin to practice what we talk about as constructive uncertainty, which is going from the X going, oh, I know what you believe, to the question mark. I don't know what you believe. Here's what I believe. So when I see someone in a meeting, and they say something, constructive uncertainty says, I don't say, oh yeah, I knew it, I knew that's what all those people would say. It says, I want to explore that. You said something and I thought something. That we really can develop the ability to be with one another and to, instead of knowing what that person meant, when in fact, I don't know what they meant.
Yeah, or it could be a conversation like, let me check this out with you for a second. I thought what I heard you say was.
Right.
Or what I interpreted you saying was. Is that accurate?
Right.
And that's such an important part of this dialogue, to be able to really understand where people are coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about pausing. Freedom is the pause between the stimulus and the response. And we have a whole model that we talk about it. But what it really means is just sort of stopping before I am positive that I know exactly what you meant, when in fact I just heard the statement.
Another is to start watching and listening to quote, the other media sources. And this is so important because this is one of the reasons why our polarization in our society is accelerating so much. It used to be that we would watch basically the same shows. We would watch news.
4 channels.
That's right. We had basically 3 or 4 channels, CBS, NBC, and ABC or whatever, and we'd watch those, and we'd get the same information. And those of us who are old enough to remember, it was pretty homogenized.
That's right.
You know, you had Huntley Brinkley over here and Walter Cronkite over there, whoever, and basically there wasn't 5% difference in the news that was covered. Not only that, but there was almost no punditry in the news. You saw at the end of the news station, you saw a guy come on with a white shirt and a tie saying, "This is an editorial," and you know, it was very clearly distinguished. And then we would interpret that through our various interpretations, but we would have a general common source of the news, and so we were all connected through what we were hearing. Now, of course, we're in a very different environment than that. We each watch different news stations. I have just Fox and MSNBC up here just as an example, but of course there are other ones as well. And we get pre-interpreted news because most of what's shown on the news is punditry. And, of course, they're very, very different. And so we're getting this constant feed of sort of an echo chamber, and what we see and what is then interpreted for us is different. And you could then, of course, toss in the Facebook pages that people have and their Twitter accounts and various other kinds of things that we're exposed to, and pretty soon we're in this echo chamber. And there's sometimes when it's really striking. I tell you, when I wrote my second book, Everyday Bias, Rosalind, I did a section, as you know, on how we elect our leaders, and it's really changed the way I watch the news now. I consciously watch several different stations, and when I'm watching the news, I flip sometimes 15 minutes or even longer. And a couple of weeks ago, when if you remember, when the Democrats in Congress were holding a sit-in and in Congress to protest gun legislation, and again, this is none of this is about which political side of this conversation you're on. It's just a function of what happened. I happened to be flipping between 3 stations, between MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, and I was watching these 3 stations and watched one for a half hour or 20 minutes, whatever it was, and another 20 minutes, another 20 minutes. I watched MSNBC first, and it was 100% about that story. Nothing else came on about that story. Then I put CNN on, and with the brief 2-minute thing, it was basically that story. And then I turned on Fox, and there was no mention of it. And it struck me that had I been watching that station all the time, I wouldn't even know that this was going on. So, and the same thing is true in reverse. Sometimes we cover things consistent.
And that's where confirmation bias shows up. So I watch that which confirms my beliefs, and I don't watch that which doesn't. And so unlike you, Howard, I think a lot of people watch my Facebook friends, 99% of them agree with me. If not, I defriend them.
That's right.
Or they defriend me. So in Twitter, so it begins to, it's the confirmation piece.
That's right. Absolutely. I just want to note that we have a couple of things. First of all, Cynthia Parker posted to all panelists, thank you very much, Cynthia, an article by the Maynard Institute and a link to the actual news story so that you could see them. And she mentions that Gavin DeBecker has a number of articles and online references to media fear tactics, which I learned were helpful for discerning how to disempower the intentionally manipulative tactics. Stephanie says she watches the German news, which she experiences to be more objective and informative. I noticed that when I was overseas, how different the news was.
Yes, very different.
And somebody else says that Gavin DeBecker's writing spell out which words are trigger words and how to rule in and out statements. It's easy to understand how to teach our brain to sort. He's the author of Protecting the Gift, Keeping Children and Teens and Parents Safe, as well as The Gift of Fear. Thank you for all of that. So all of these are factors. Another one is, and this is so important, to be willing to acknowledge when you're wrong and apologize. Look, we're human. We're going to lose it sometimes. You get into during this political season, you get into a political argument with people, and pretty soon you're hot and triggered, and you say something and you regret it, and then we sit there and we feel bad about it. And what do we do with that? Well, all too often what we have to do is, if we get our pride getting in the way or ego getting in the way, we have to double down. You know, as opposed to saying, you know what, I've lost my temper, I apologize. I shouldn't have been, I was being oversensitive, I was being defensive, and rebuild the relationship. You know, we make mistakes as human beings, and yet unfortunately we live in a society in which people have forgotten how to say I'm sorry. And so often that's all it takes, what it takes to rebuild a relationship. In fact, sometimes it actually leaves people feeling better about the person to know that they're willing to own their stuff and clean it up.
There's a wonderful quote in here that comes from Christopher, and it says that at the funeral of the Dallas police, George Bush had a wonderful, interesting quote. Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions.
That's so true.
And so being willing to acknowledge that I was wrong really does begin to help that.
Another is to open a dialogue in a constructive way in your family, company, school, organization, hospital, community. We talked about this earlier. You know, one of the great things, one of the reasons that we've chosen to do our work in business is because in business environments we have a remarkable opportunity to be with a diverse group of people. You know, in most environments in our life, we live in a pretty homogeneous environment. You know, we may live in a neighborhood with people, but the people we hang out with are often similar to us. Wherever we go, we're likely running into people who are more similar to us. But when we come to work, we can't choose who we get put in the same office with. We have to sit where we're told to sit. We have to work with who we're told to work with. And so often, as a result of it, that leaves us in a situation where we've got more diversity, more difference around us, and therefore we have an opportunity to have these dialogues in ways that we might not in other parts of our life. Pamela shared that the name for that fundamental attribution error is the name for this phenomenon of looking at something and assuming a particular thought about it or a particular bent about it because of the person it comes from.
Right. Yeah.
Another one is to engage with and learn about those people you consider to be, quote, others, and that is to put yourself in people's world. One of the things that we know is one of the best ways to begin to soften our biases is when we take about learning about different cultures we're in. And we see this happening now in some communities around the country. Some of the police departments, some of whom we've worked with and other people have been working with, are doing things like going into the community and having conversations about Black Lives Matter with activists. They're sharing with activists what they're afraid of and what it feels like to be a police officer today. I know when I was working with a police department recently, the first question that we started with in the conversation was, what does it feel like to be a police officer today? What are the biases that you run into? What are the stereotypes people have about you? Because when we can get them to look at those stereotypes and understand it from their own perspective, then, as Rosalind said before, they're likely to have more empathy, more compassion for people from the other side. So, let's just pause for a moment. We have a few more slides, but I want to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions, and then I want to share a particularly valuable tool with you that comes from Elizabeth Lesser. Let's see if there are any questions on the board here. Okay, nothing up right now that we haven't covered. Okay, so one great way to do this at work or with your friends is to seek out people who have other points of view from you. Now we've just gone through a very intense primary season, so depending upon which side of the political fence you're on, that might have been tension between Democrats or between Republicans, and that's, you know, largely coming together now. But now we get to start again, and that is that person on the other side, and this is particularly true in this presidential election more than any in our lifetimes, because the percentage of negative about both of these candidates is so high. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have the highest negative evaluations of any candidates in history. And so as a result of that, there's a lot of very strong feeling against the other as well as feeling for the particular candidate that we support. So Elizabeth Lesser came up with this, you know, this is a modified model that she came up with, and she calls it take the other to lunch. I want to imagine that you have somebody, and obviously you've got to choose somebody who's willing and interested in having a constructive dialogue. And you start by agreeing on ground rules. And the ground rules are, I'm not here to persuade you. I'm not here to defend. I'm not here to interrupt you. I'm here to be curious, authentic, and listen. In other words, I'm here to understand why it is that you support, let's say, that candidate.
Right.
Let's say I'm a Trump supporter and I'm working with somebody who's a Clinton supporter or vice versa. And I say to them, you know what, I would love to have a conversation with you to kind of get into each other's heads and understand, not to try to convince each other, because we're not going to convince each other.
Right.
We're not likely to convince each other, but just to really understand where we're coming from, so that we can get back in touch with each other's humanity. And that's really the purpose of this, is that oftentimes we lose track of each other's humanity because we begin to associate with them with their beliefs and the stereotype that we have about people with those beliefs. So by doing that, we begin to objectify them. They don't become my friend or my coworker who supports Clinton or who supports Trump, they become a Trump supporter or a Clinton supporter, and all the stereotypes and images of those people out there. So it starts by just saying, you know what, we're not going to persuade, we're not going to defend, we're not going to interrupt each other, we're just going to be curious, we're going to be real with each other, we're going to listen to each other. Then you go through a process, a very specific process of asking 4 questions. By the way, we will be sending you a copy of, if you'd like, any of you who signed up, we'll be sending you a copy of this PowerPoint, so you'll have all of these things to look at. You know, it'll have, you know, some of the pictures and stuff we'll remove, but it'll have all the key points for you, so you don't need to be scribbling really fast. I know that both Rosalind and I can talk pretty fast at times. The first question is, what are some of your life experiences that have led you to feel the way you do?
Now, imagine this is a conversation between a police officer and a young African-American male.
Yeah.
It's that, what are some of your life experiences that have led you? That begins to really help us to understand.
Absolutely. Then the second question is, so you each get a chance to answer this question first. Then you each get a chance to answer the second question. What issues deeply concern you? And one of the things that I like to add to this question is, what are you afraid of? You know, because fear is such a driver that just speaking the fear, sometimes getting out of our heads and out where we can look at it, helps us be more rational about what we're dealing with. So what issues deeply concern you relative to obviously the dynamic we're talking about? The third question is, what have you always wanted to ask somebody from the other side? So if it's a young African-American man and a police officer, what have I always wanted to ask a police officer? What have I always wanted to ask a young man in that age group living in the community? And to get those questions answered, again, not challenging them, but just listening to them. And then finally, and this one is so important, is there anything you'd like to say to clean up the past? In other words, sometimes when we actually have these conversations, you find yourself feeling like, wow, I've just been assuming so much about you. And the truth is, when I hear you talk, I realize I was all wrong. So I want you to know I apologize for that. I apologize for the fact that I was making false assumptions about you. Or maybe I did something based on those false assumptions, and I didn't include that person in a particular way. I excluded them in a conversation, or I haven't asked them out to lunch like I have my other colleagues at work or something like that. I'd say, now I want you to know I apologize for that, moving forward into the future. And the reason this is important is because we tend to drag the past into the present and the future because we never complete it. But when we do this, when we clean up the past, when we actually say, okay, I accept that I've done that, I'm now going to apologize for that. Now I have the opportunity to create a new future that's not bound by the past. And this is so important. And this can be done, by the way, with groups of people as well as with individuals.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then finally, the last point is to be an ally. It's so important to reach out to other people. A number of people asked before, is it appropriate to go out of your way to be friendly towards other people? And my answer would be not being phony, but absolutely, to make it clear to people that not everybody who looks like me treats people who look like you in this way. That when you say hello to somebody, when you say hello to a police officer, when you say hello to a Muslim citizen who you can tell by their dress appears to be Muslim. When you say hello to somebody who you know people tend to be frightened of, it's like you're throwing a stone in the other side of the seesaw to balance things out a little bit. It reminds people that there's some nice people out there, some friendly people out there, some warm people out there who are like that.
Just a quick story, Howard. I was driving to work on a back road the other day, and the traffic was stopped because of a wreck. And I have a very small two-seater sports car, and I had the top down, and the car behind me was a big truck, and it was an older white male, rural area, and I know that in my mind I was going, so I wasn't paying any attention. We came to a stop, and I turned, and he was standing next to my door, and he said to me, I just want to tell you, it was so nice. You let people in the traffic, and people aren't helpful like that, and I just wanted to let you know that I thought that was really great. Now, I know that had I seen him getting out of his truck, I might have tried to pull my car out and go traffic in the wrong way. And in fact, because and he just wanted me to know, he thought it was nice that I let people in traffic. That's what you begin to understand, is that the stories we make up about one another when we become allies, change everything.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, being an ally doesn't mean taking care of people. It means standing by the side. We love this quote from the Aboriginal activist group in Queensland, Australia. They say, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. Now, there are a couple of statements that people sent that I want to, somebody said one possible addition to the ground was to suspend judgment. I would modify that a little bit. It's very difficult for human beings to really suspend judgment because our minds are really judgment machines. But what we can do is be aware of our judgments.
Right.
And to notice, wow, I'm judging that person. Is that a rational judgment or am I projecting something there? Somebody says that we could just somehow get back to having simple, courteous conversations with one another, we go so far in breaking down the walls, and that's, of course, true. And then somebody else said, what about ground rules? My experience is that times the opportunity inadvertently gets some people in the opportunity to re-abuse, and that's true. It's very important when we have these, and you'll see that if you get the resource guide we're sending out, we talk very specifically about creating very clear ground rules for people for these kinds of conversations, because if we don't have a container that we know is safe to have these conversations in, it can create more stress and more fear. And that's why the person who holds space for the conversation, who facilitates the conversation, has to be very conscious about taking a very neutral position. Now, it's important to know that taking a neutral position doesn't mean you can't have a strong point of view.
Yes.
You can have a very strong point of view as long as you recognize it as a point of view. I love to debate. I was a debater in high school, and I love a rigorous debate. And then my friends and I say, all right, that was a good one, let's move on. Right. Sometimes I forget when I'm on Facebook, for example, that the person I'm debating may not have that same sense of debate with me, and I've made that mistake, unfortunately, a number of times.
Well, and we talk about it's the difference between truth with a capital T and truth with a small t.
Exactly right.
And the fact that it might be my truth, which is with a small t, but it is not, in fact, this sort of universal truth. So I can own that that is what's true for me, and that's very important, that I own what's true for me, and that as we're having this conversation, that you own what's true for you, and that what we know is there is no universal truth. Even though we all say there's no universal truth. However,
right. Yeah, John Searle, the great philosopher from the University of California, said that what we call reality is really interpretation. But if you peel back that, you'll find more interpretation. If you peel it back even farther, you'll find more interpretation. But finally, when you get to the core of it, what you'll find is interpretation.
Yeah.
And of course, the last thing is that communities of support are so important, and it's so important that you have communities of diverse support, communities that include people who disagree with you, people who love you and care about you but disagree with you. Somebody said earlier that they wanted those questions that I shared, the Elizabeth Lesser tool, to have a curious conversation with our families. You know, sometimes even within our families, we forget that we love each other more than all this stuff. Nelson Mandela said, may your choices reflect your hopes and not your fears. And this is, I guess, the bottom line, which is, you know, at times like this, when we're really fearful, we're often left looking inward. We're left reacting to that fear. We forget what our vision is. And it's so important at times like this, more than any other time, that we realize that we can transcend these things. You know, what's important is that we don't stop believing, it's possible, because as soon as we give up and become cynical, there's no way that we can break through these barriers.
Yeah, and it is a piece of work that happens between you and I, and us and others, and not us and them, us and others, that our us gets larger and larger, and it is absolutely imperative. There was a video that we couldn't show you, but we will put a link to it, that is about police officers and Black Lives Matter group having a barbecue together, and they dance and they have a great time, and it teaches us how to believe, and that's what they were doing.
Yeah, and somebody asked if you could get a replay also of the race and women video that Leslie and Rosalind did, excuse me. Yes, that's available, and if you send on our website, it's available. So if any of you are interested in learning more about our work, my two books are up. Both of these cover, especially Everyday Bias, covers a lot of what we're talking about. You can also learn more about us at www.cookross.com. We've pretty much run out of time, but one person said, this discussion makes me think of the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. Wonderful TED Talk. You should definitely trigger that. We want to thank you all so much for being on the call. This is such
Absolutely.
an important time, and we encourage you to join us for some of our subsequent ones. If you have any topics that you think are particularly important in our culture right now, we will continue to do these free webinars as we've done for the last several months about these topics, just because we believe it's our way of contributing to our overall conversation. So please feel free to send us a note and say, gee, would you all be interested in doing one about such and such? I can't promise that we'll do them, but we certainly will do everything we can.
Thank
so
you
please
for your
be
time.
safe.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time, and enjoy the rest of your summer.